4, 3, 2, and 1. Welcome back, everyone. It's been a long time since we've done one of these, but as I mentioned, the shift method is back in action. We got content, we got educational videos, and of course, we're bringing the podcast back. And this is one that I actually had planned. Apologies to my man here. We tried to do it a few times, but my life got hectic and we had to cancel. So I'm very, very excited to have with me on the podcast one of my former students, one of my former coworkers, Austin Lee. Go ahead and introduce yourself to the people.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Austin. I'm a senior majoring in kinesiology here at Purdue, and I'm also working on a minor in nutrition. I've been training with the co-rec or Purdue Rec since January 2019. And right now I am currently working at Park West Fitness in West Lafayette as well, doing personal training. So that's where you can find me.
Absolutely. And what you guys are going to find now is that Austin is an extremely humble, soft-spoken, but of course knowledgeable person. He forgot to mention his most important credential in the industry is that he is absolutely yoked. Like, the dude is jacked. So he'll plug his Instagram later. You can see the guy. He makes really, really good content. Really good if you're looking to, especially if you're a new trainer and you're looking for form in terms of how do I accomplish these lifts? What is it supposed to look like? And the main topic we're going to talk about today, which is hypertrophy training and a little bit of nutrition. That's kind of Austin's specialty here. So we're going to talk all things hypertrophy today. So Austin, just kind of to kick off the conversation, right? A lot of people hear that term thrown around, hypertrophy, toning, muscle building. Let's just kind of get our definitions down pat, right? So can you just kind of tell everyone what exactly is hypertrophy?
Yeah, so basically when it comes to muscle hypertrophy, there's two types of hypertrophy of the muscle. We have myofibrillar, as well as sarcoplasmic. And then what we'll focus on today is myofibrillar, just because that is the actual growing of the muscle cell. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy refers to expansion of the sarcoplasm, which is basically the cytoplasm of a muscle cell. But that can be another topic on its own.
Absolutely.
So when a client comes to me and says, obviously, if they want to build muscle, that falls under muscle hypertrophy. If they want to say they're trying to get toned, if they're trying to lose body fat, gain muscle at the same time, kind of do a recomposition, that's also muscle hypertrophy. So there's a lot of different ways people can word it. And it all just falls under the same umbrella.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very rarely will people be like, yeah, my goal is hypertrophy training. A lot of people don't know what that term means. So yeah, the general sense is enlarging or building of the skeletal muscle, right? That's kind of the goal that we're training here. When we're talking about trying to build muscle mass, I know that there's a lot of training considerations, right? And as we were talking off air before we started, this is a field of research that's changing quite rapidly. There's a lot more research going into it. People like, Renaissance periodization. There's a lot of different people that are going into this topic. So a lot of things to talk about. So from a programming standpoint, Austin, kind of thinking like sets and reps, those kind of parameters, what are we looking for when we're programming for hypertrophy specifically?
So in terms of hypertrophy, we're mostly going to focus on volume. That's going to be like the number one for growing muscle. And as far as the equation for volume goes, it's going to be your sets times your reps times your load. And all three of these variables can be manipulated to increase volume. However, I would say that increasing sets is going to have the most impact on your volume, just because like if you just think about it, if you're doing 2 sets of 10 for bench press versus 5 sets of 10, it's going to be a substantial difference in your volume.
As opposed to just increasing by 5 pounds and keeping sets and reps the same, right?
Right.
So if you don't like math out there, I'm sorry, this may not be the podcast for you. We're going to do some multiplication. No, I'm just kidding. But yes, so volume being one of those key components. Of course, there are other important factors as well, which we'll get into. But volume being sets times reps times load. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know load is a variable you can change, but like you mentioned, sets being kind of like that, I guess you can call it a multiplier of your work. do you ever just use volume as sets times reps, or do you also like to really include the weight component as well?
So I would say you can do either or. You can do either or when it comes to that. More so on like the load itself. I wouldn't say that it matters too much in regards to as long as you're taking the sets close to failure. And what that means is you're taking the set 3 to 4 reps away from failure, starting there. And in terms of what's called the size principle, Henman's size principle, right? It's a part of exercise physiology. Basically, what it says is that your smaller motor units are going to be recruited first, followed by your larger motor units belonging to the fast twitch fibers. And as long as you take a set close to failure, what will happen is as you approach failure, those larger motor units will be recruited. So you can do that, as well as if you're doing super heavy loads. Let's say you're doing maybe like a 3-rep max. Those fast twitch motor units are already going to be recruited right away, just because the load is very heavy. So they need that. However, like I said, if you can do lightweight and approach failure and still get that same effect, just because of the size principle.
Absolutely. And this is something that me and you have posted about and talked about quite often, right? Which is because it's a cool way to go about programming hypertrophy, especially when the pandemic happened. It was for those who were trying to, at least maintain their gains or trying to build on their gains, but they maybe didn't have access to gym equipment. Volume is kind of a key component, but like Austin mentioned, training to or near failure with a good portion of your exercises, right? Now, what does that mean for sets and reps? That means that your reps don't have to be in that stereotypical 8 to 12 rep range, right? The reason why that's ideal could be ideal from a time perspective, right? So if I do 3 to 5 sets, 8 to 12 reps, 1 to 2 minute rest period, for an hour training session, that might make the most sense, right? It might be an efficient way of training. But if you don't have access to that, for example, you don't have heavy enough weights available to you to where you can't, get enough motor unit recruitment when you get to those 8 to 10 reps, you can get even higher. So don't think that when you're programming, it has to just be that old school formula, 3 to 5 sets, 8 to 12, 3 to 5 sets, 8 to 12 reps at like 60 to 75% of your 1 rep max. When it comes to talking about that, going a little bit into the sets and reps, Austin, what's kind of like the general recommendation? Like, is it just you can do sets to or reps and sets to infinity? Or like, is there kind of like a cutoff where we stop seeing returns?
I would say in general, starting around 5 reps all the way up to 25, 30 is a good cutoff. And I know that's basically how they do things over at Renaissance Periodization. I think the logic behind that starting at 5 is because they don't go all the way to starting with one rep, just because the load is going to be so great. Doing a 1 rep max is going to accumulate a lot of fatigue, which is going to prevent you from being able to accumulate a lot of volume, enough volume to grow, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. And imagine trying to do like 20 sets of 1, right? Maybe the motor unit recruitment is very high, but it's not a good way to efficiently get in as much volume.
Right. Because that's just going to fry your nervous system, and it's basically just going to kill you.
Right.
So,
and on the other side, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you can go ahead. I was just going to talk about the higher reps, but
that's what I was going to say. So is it on the other side with the higher reps, is it start getting into more endurance territory? Is that why you don't recommend going too high?
I would say so. I would say that it's mostly just going to, like, reps beyond 30 is going to activate your slower twitch fibers, which are not the most prone to muscle growth. The ones that are going to be to have the ability to grow the most are going to be your fast twitch fibers.
Awesome. So we got volume is a key component.
Yeah.
We got a decent understanding of sets and reps, 5 to 20, 25, right? And training to or near failure. When we say training to or near failure, what does that look like from a programming standpoint? Like RPE wise, percentage wise, what can that look like?
So I always teach what's called relative intensity, what we're talking about right now, in terms of reps in reserve, just because it's easier to conceptualize as opposed to RPE.
Mm-hmm.
So reps in the reserve is basically after you do a set, how many more reps can you perform with good technique, basically to failure. So, for example, if I'm doing a set of bench press and I'm doing 100 pounds, I do 10 reps. And then that next set, let's say I do an AMRAP, as many reps as possible. I use the same weight, 100 pounds, and then I get 13 reps. And then after that, I just get pinned under the bar. No more, right?
Yeah.
So that first set, that would mean that I had 3 more reps in reserve just because that second set I hit 13, right?
Gotcha.
And then translated over to like RPE, that would be RPE.7.
Correct. And then, so does it, I think when I remember first learning about hypertrophy and motor unit recruitment, I always thought that the relative intensity, whether it be reps in reserve, RPE, or percentage one or max, had to be relatively high. But if you're doing sets of 20 to 25, your relative intensity is going to be on the lighter side, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is kind of the lower cutoff for intensity in terms of percentage or RIR, whatever it may be?
So I would say that it's around 4 to 5, I believe. This is a tricky topic just because obviously there's more research coming out, but
yeah.
They recently found that I don't know the specific study, but they say that beginners have a hard time estimating relative intensity, and obviously
Mm-hmm.
this just comes from like lack of experience. But I do remember there was a study that was like untrained individuals were taking sets of like their 10 rep max, and then the researchers had them go all the way to failure. So basically, like that first set, they may have gotten 10, but then all the way to failure, they got 16. So we're training around like 6, 7 reps in reserve, right?
Yep.
I would say it's not a super important thing to take into account for beginners, just because obviously if they're brand new to the gym, any stimulus is going to be more than none, right? So they're going to grow regardless. They're going to grow regardless.
Absolutely. And then another key factor. So we talked a little bit about intensity. We talked a little bit about motor unit recruitment, and then volume is kind of that key factor. What about frequency in terms of like how much people train? Like we always hear like, this is the best split. That's the best split. You got to train this many times per week. What do we say about that?
Right. Well, so for number one, the best split is going to fit your schedule. But in terms of like optimal hypertrophy, I would say hitting each muscle group at least twice a week, if not more, would be more optimal. And it just makes sense. Let's say you were doing a 2-day-a-week workout and you're doing full body both days, and you want to get the most muscle gain as possible, right? You would have to equate for volume over that whole week as if you're doing maybe like a 5 or 6 day split. So you would have to pack all that volume into those 2 days, right?
Right.
And example, if you're doing leg day and you're doing like 5 sets of 10 squats, 5 sets of 10 leg press, like 5 sets of 10 lunges, you're going to be dead. And those sets in themselves are going to be reduced in quality in terms of like how stimulative they're going to be for hypertrophy. So it makes sense. It makes sense from that perspective to be training more often.
Absolutely. I just finished my overreaching week and I did have 5 sets of 8 on back squat and then 4 sets of 10 on leg press. And you're looking at the program and you're like, oh my God, what am I doing? But that's how overreaching week is sometimes, man. Awesome. And then in terms of, so frequency, so when you train, or let's just do this from like a personal versus a client standpoint, right? So personally, when you train for hypertrophy, what do you find works best with your schedule? Do you do like a 5-day split, a 6-day split? And what do those splits kind of look like so people can get some ideas of how they can potentially break up their own training?
So I personally train 6 days a week and I just do push-pull legs. And you can reorganize that order based on like your preference or like what you want to prioritize earlier in the week. I would say that obviously push-pull legs is going to be 6 days a week exclusive. So you can't really There's no really wiggle room with that. There are more advanced splits that you could do. Let's say like you could do full body 5-6 days a week as well. And on those different days, you can prioritize different like muscle groups while still doing full body. So you're able to recover.
Absolutely. And like you said, it all just goes into how many days can the client train, right? Like there's no necessarily perfect splits. The one like, okay, well, if my client only has 3 days available, maybe I need to do an upper lower full body, or I need to do, maybe they're only ready to do one time a week. So I do a, upper body, lower body, and then maybe a cardio accessory day for general health, right? It's all going to depend on what they have available to them. And of course, their training status, because if they're new, we're not going to give them 5 sets of 10 and train each muscle group 3 to 4 times a week, right? So a lot of variables go into play there. Another big topic with hypertrophy, did I miss anything from just starting with basic program design that you want to hit on?
Let's see.
So I think we talked about most of the stuff for kind of just the basic definitions of parameters, right?
I think we hit everything right there.
Awesome. So next, I guess you could say a controversial topic, or more so just people aren't exactly sure what the answer is protein, right? So in terms of intake of protein, when people are training for hypertrophy, what's a good general recommendation? I know we're not registered dietitians, but just kind of the, short and to the point, what are we looking for protein wise?
Yeah, throw that disclaimer on here so we don't get sued. So from our NIH calculator, I believe they recommend like 1.6 to 3.4 grams per kilogram for body weight. And in terms of, I guess, our freedom units, that's right, 0.8 to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight.
Gotcha. Yeah, for my metric folk out there. But no, then that's not a crazy amount, right? So like the typical thing we used to hear is like 1 gram per pound body weight, right? So I'm 180 pounds roughly, eat 1 gram of protein per pound body weight. I should be in the ballpark. Do you find that this thing to focus on is important for people who are just getting into resistance training and looking for hypertrophy? Or would you say this is more so something that you would layer on later?
I would say that, at the very beginning, it won't be something too important to focus on. But as you start to progress in your training age, maybe like you've been training for like a month, if you're not seeing the progress that you'd like to see 2 months, 3 months, then this is something that you definitely need to take a look at.
Absolutely. And that's a big thing people, I always want to harp on is that training, the purpose of training, or at least hypertrophy training, right, is we are causing micro trauma essentially to our muscle fibers, right? We're causing damage. And then the goal is to elicit an anabolic repair process. So that way our body can adapt adequately and then hopefully get the response we want. If we don't get the proper nutrition after our training, all that training is going to go, down the drain, right? Because we're not able to supply our body with the ability to repair. And that kind of goes into another talking point, which is sleep, right? That's another big factor. So in terms of recovery, so we're giving out like kind of a sleep recommendation. What would you say to that?
So before we go on to the sleep, I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the protein intake.
Yeah, absolutely.
That 0.8 to 1.5 grams per pound body weight, that's a very general recommendation. Obviously, there's going to be some people that are outliers that wouldn't fall into that.
Of course.
If we have an obese client, right? If they're like 320 pounds, they don't need 320 pounds or 320 grams of protein. That's just way too much.
That's a good point.
So I would say there is an aspect of that does take into account one's lean body mass. Obviously, the higher amount of lean body mass you have, the more it's going to take on your end to maintain or even build more. And it's a very interesting field just because the research surrounding that area is always changing, right?
And that's a good point because, right, like if let's say we have 2 people that both weigh 180 pounds, my body fat percentage and skeletal muscle mass is going to be much different than someone else's. So would that affect the amount of relative protein that I need? So that is an interesting thing to consider. Oh, and also that's one other thing I forgot to mention, because this is always another thing with protein too before we get to sleep. I know I'm backtracking, but this is important, right? The anabolic window we always hear, right? People always say, oh, well, after workout, especially resistance training, immediately you got to just chug that shake. Like the very second you're doing your last set of cable curls, when that plate hits the ground, that shake needs to be just downed, right? What do we say about the anabolic window or recovery from a protein consumption standpoint?
So the research says that it's basically a myth, right? As long as you're getting in adequate protein in throughout the day. And I would say that if you want it to be safe, um, maybe within like 3 hours after your workout, getting in some food, I would say you're good to go there.
Which I say is pretty typical. The only exception I might see that is if for our late gym goers, they might, work out at like 10 or 11 at night, and then you may not be having dinner after that. But with that, you could just down a shake or, maybe some Greek yogurt or something that works well with your stomach before you go to bed. So I wouldn't worry too much about having to get your protein in the second your workout is done. And then in terms of muscle protein synthesis, I know one other area that I think is really cool that we both agreed to focus on is leucine. So can you kind of just briefly touch on what leucine is?
Yeah, so it is an essential amino acid, one of the 9, I believe. And it is basically the trigger for muscle protein synthesis, right? And I wouldn't say it is muscle protein synthesis isn't sort of like a light switch where either it's on or off. It's more so like a light switch that has a dimmer, right? You can turn that dimmer up brighter, or it can be turned down.
I like that. That's a good way to put it. And the recommendation I've heard is roughly getting 3 to 4 grams. That's per meal, right? Would be the ideal way to do it.
Yeah. Yes.
Gotcha. Very, very good. So yeah, protein, really important. May vary slightly depending on lean body mass, but you can use your body weight as a general rule of thumb. And then, of course, you don't have to worry too much about the timing of the protein or the meals. Just making sure you get enough in throughout the day to help support yourself. Going back to sleep. So again, this is a recovery process. We're trying to stimulate an anabolic response to help us recover. So what is kind of a good recommendation for sleep?
I would say, just like the doctors say, like 7 to 8 hours, 7 to 9 hours, and you'd be good to go there. If you don't hit those 7 to 9 hours a night, you can throw in naps if you have the time. But
just the ability to take a nap just puts my mind at ease, because it's hard, man. Sometimes you can't get those 7 to 8 hours, man, and you need those naps. Very, very good. So yeah, that one's short, sweet, to the point, right? Make sure you're getting your sleep. Make sure you're getting proper protein in. So that way you can reap the benefits of your training, right? Because when you're in the gym, you're breaking the muscle down, and the hope is to recover afterwards. And then in terms of rest intervals, kind of another training parameter, how do you generally program rest when you're writing a program for hypertrophy?
So I would say, as a general rule of thumb for all of your exercises, around three or so minutes as just baseline. If you need more, obviously you can take more. I know that the Principles of Hypertrophy book, they go super in depth with this, and I can just talk about a few of those.
Yeah, absolutely.
They touch upon. So you want to rest long enough so that your main muscle that's working during the exercise is recovered. You're ready to go again, as well as the synergists. So basically, if you're doing like a bench press, you feel like your chest is ready to go again. Your triceps are ready to go. Your front delt's not fried. You're good to go there. In terms of your cardiorespiratory system, you just want to make sure that your heart rate's not jumping out of your chest and you're still panting for air, right?
Right.
That you're recovered to the point where you can go again. And then the last one they touch on is basically like your central nervous system, like from a psychological standpoint, like, are you ready to go for another hard set? And then if you can check those 3 boxes in, you're pretty much good to go.
I like that last one. I haven't really considered that, right? Because when you are training to or near failure for multiple sets, you got to be ready psychologically, man. You got to be prepped, because if you're really doing it, like, it is grueling. to do like a set of 10 bench press, 1 rep in reserve, no reps in reserve, and to do that for 4 sets plus, you got to be ready to do that. This was also, rest interval was one of those things that, because basically the gist of what I'm hearing, Austin, is there isn't necessarily you have to take this specific rest period. It's more so when the individual is ready to be able to complete the session and achieve adequate volume that was prescribed, and also just making sure that, they're ready to get the task done. And what works with their schedule, right? Like if you have 2 hours to kill at the gym and you need to take longer rest, that's fine. If you only have an hour and you're on the clock and you need to get going, you might have to take shorter rest intervals. This is like one of those areas in program design that I feel like refuses to go away whenever you read like a program design textbook, is that hypertrophy always has that, 45 to 90 second window. Like you have to be within this very specific window of rest interval. Otherwise you don't reap the benefits of the adaptation. And I learned this in Dr. Zordo's class with my professors back in undergrad, is that the reasoning behind that was twofold. One was a time efficiency standpoint. Makes sense, right? You got an hour in the gym, you're doing, 8 to 10 exercises, taking a shorter rest interval makes sense so you can get everything done. I can get on board with that. The second reason was they've done studies with hormone levels, and it just so happened that from a physiological standpoint, when you took shorter rest intervals, right, like when we learned in X-Phys, shorter rest intervals, certain hormones are more elevated. Things like, lactic acid, lactate, testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1, certain hormones are going to be elevated that we typically see as a response of growth or hypertrophy, right? We think testosterone, the first thing you think is, oh, I want that elevated when I'm doing my sets, because if it's elevated in my blood, that must mean I'm getting a better hypertrophy response, right? Not so simple, because I hope I don't butcher this, but if I remember correctly, when you take short rest intervals, I believe it was lactate or lactic acid, I believe one of the two, when those are high in the bloodstream, which occurs when you take short rest intervals, the receptors for testosterone are higher, meaning they have a higher affinity to be absorbed and show in the bloodstream. So it's kind of a false marker, right? You have this acute spike in testosterone, which makes it seem like when you do a blood test, like, oh my God, short rest interval, spike in testosterone. The problem is it's only done acutely because of these physiological changes. What we don't see is that over time, those acute spikes have much of an impact. So what does matter is that you are able to get adequate rest, and then you can actually complete the sets. Because here's an example I always like to give, right? Austin, I'm writing a program for you. You got 4 sets of 10 on back squat at, let's say, 1 to 2 reps left in the tank. And I'm giving you a 60-second rest period. How's that going to, with a mask on too? There you go. How's that going to go? Are you going to hit every single set?
Most likely not. If I were to, then I would most likely have to incorporate lighter back off sets, just because there's no way you'll be able to match that first set with just a minute of rest.
Absolutely. And then because let's say you lower the load substantially to accomplish that, to fit in that rest interval, that makes your volume go down. Mm-hmm. So it makes more sense to me, if you have the time to do so, to kind of exaggerate your rest periods and then complete the prescribed volume. Is that kind of how you approach programming as well?
Yeah. And I just wanted to add, you made a really interesting point. I did not know about the whole lactic acid. And
I believe that's it. Someone quote me on that if I'm saying the wrong thing. So I apologize if I do, but I'm pretty sure that's it.
Yeah. I was reading into the hypertrophy book that I mentioned, and they do mention that sort of like potentially another way for muscle growth to occur is the accumulation of metabolites like lactic acid. So it's just a byproduct of anaerobic metabolism. And basically that's just the energy pathway that our body is going to use to do resistance training exercise, just because it's not prolonged. So we're not able to use oxygen to fuel those pathways. And where's I going with this? So basically the accumulation of lactate, as well as other byproducts such as like hydrogen ions, which causes the lowering of pH in your blood, all of these factors can contribute to activating pathways that lead to muscle hypertrophy, if that makes sense.
I say, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
So it does make sense from a programming standpoint. If you wanted to incorporate what they call like metabolite techniques to accumulate these metabolites to trigger muscle growth on top of your regular straight sets, what are called, like if you did like 3 sets of 10 or whatever.
Right.
It's just another technique.
Gotcha. Would a metabolite set, would that be like something like an AMRAP or like a cluster set?
So there's a lot of different things that can fall under that. Those that you mentioned do, as well as like supersets, drop sets, myo reps, that kind of thing.
Gotcha.
A lot of different things.
Myo reps. No, that's a skip for me for right
like
now.
rest pause.
Absolutely. Very, very cool. So we got the rest interval thing taken care of. What about specificity of training when you're writing programs? How does that kind of fit into the hypertrophy story?
So you basically are going to do like a needs analysis with yourself or your client. Like if someone was doing if they're a competitive bodybuilder, they could get feedback from the judges and they would list out, what needs improvement or like that sort of thing. So then you can take that and then think about how you're gonna plan your training to grow those specific components. If someone says, I just want to grow everything, then obviously you can equate volume pretty much equally across the board.
Absolutely. And I like this point that you mentioned in our notes, is that while yes, you do of course the goal of hypertrophy is resistance training, right? You also still want to make sure that you're hitting those basic guidelines for cardiovascular health, right? Because we want to make sure we're taking care of our heart, we're taking care of our lungs. You want to make sure that we're still getting those recommendations in as well. But you're right. And kind of on that, I think too, like a debate that always goes on is, is one exercise better than the other for hypertrophy? So like when you're thinking of exercise selection, how do you kind of go about that?
So this could be like a topic on its own. Essentially, what we want to do is we want to pick the exercises that are the most stimulative in nature for that person, as well as the least fatiguing, right? So for everyone, it's going to be different for how exercises feel to them.
Right.
So for example, let's say for me, I personally don't do bent over rows. I'd rather opt for like a machine or like a hammer strength type of equipment, just because doing bent over rows, you're in that bent over position, and it can be pretty taxing, as well as on your nervous system and your erectors, just because you have to maintain that position. So for me, that exercise could become to a point where I don't really feel it in my back at all, my lats, my rhomboids, my mid trap, that kind of thing, where it just turns into an exercise where I'm basically just trying to hold myself in that position, if that makes sense.
Well, Austin, I'll put your mind at ease, man. I actually have bent over rows today I do a very similar split. I do a upper body push, or I guess I should say I do chest, triceps, calves. I do back, biceps, and I do legs and shoulders, excluding calves. Today is my second back and bicep day. I am doing bent over rows. I'm doing them for you, so you don't have to worry about doing them. I'll handle all those for you, bud. You can stay with those deep Smith machine squats with however much stupid amount of weight you got on there, man. But yeah, no, it's funny you say that, because of course there's the basic exercise we go to, right? The bread and butter, the big three are always going to be solid with building muscle. Deadlift, little debate there, right? But I'd say your squat variations, your bench, hip thrust, or some kind of hinge pattern, your rows, right? I find I love them because I feel them a lot, and they stimulate, my quads and my glutes quite a bit. But man, high bar back squat, my heart rate goes up to like 130, 140 after every set of 8. It's ridiculous, but I love them. Now I have been getting into the deep squat as hard as they are, because the amount of range of motion I got to do, the deep Smith machine squat, man, that's a game changer.
All guy. Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Good stuff. So yeah, so finding out what works well for the individual, right? It's like, hey, you seem to respond well to this exercise, or this one, you can feel yourself working, but you don't feel like after every set, you just ran a marathon, right? So what's going to work for them? So now, okay. Sorry, go ahead, bud.
I know that one of the reasons I choose to do a lot of exercises in the Smith machine as opposed to like a free weight variation is just because free weights are going to be more fatiguing in nature. Just because whenever you're doing those exercises, obviously you have to like stabilize the weight as well as try to use the targeted muscles. With the Smith machine, it takes that stabilization factor out of the equation. Also, my brain just kind of.
Nah, you're good, bud. No, I was going to say that, like, which makes sense for you, right? Because you primarily train strictly hypertrophy, right? That's kind of like your main goal. I also have been doing hypertrophy for a decent amount of time, but a subset goal for me is athletic performance, because I just like to be as athletic as possible as demonstration for athletes I coach. I also like to play basketball recreationally. So while I do train hypertrophy, I still keep in some lifts and some variations that might have a strength and conditioning component. So I do use a little bit less machines for some things. Like, I still love barbell bench. I still love high bar back squat. I love bent over row. I do deadlift from time to time, barbell overhead press. So I still keep in those free weight and barbell exercises. But if I was doing just pure hypertrophy, if I wanted to get as yoked as possible, definitely would consider using more of the Smith machine, the hammer strength. I love hammer strength, and some of the machines as well.
I remembered what I wanted to say.
There we
go. Any of the powerlifters out there, I know that they know that if you potentially like misgroove a rep on, let's say, bench press, that could make or break your set right there. Mm-hmm. I know I've watched some IPF powerlifting where the lifter, they got called for like a proper unrack, that kind of thing, and they had to rack the weight, and then they only could rest maybe like 30 seconds to a minute, and they had to go and unrack the weight again, and they actually missed the lift. So it's definitely that type of thing can definitely play a factor into like which exercises I'm going to choose. Obviously, if I'm doing a Smith machine bench, I don't have to unrack the bar. I just unhook it.
Absolutely. I want to go on a quick tangent before we get into block programming, because this is something that I've been catching up on some hypertrophy podcasts. And this is one that I hear, and I want to get your opinion if you heard anything about this. The relationship between hypertrophy and strength. Mm-hmm. So historically, like reading my CSCS textbook, basic physiology, we know that they're programmed different. They're different physiological responses, right? Hypertrophy, like we've been saying, increase size, surface area of the skeletal muscle, the actual unit itself, the contractile unit itself, right? That's one. Strength is more of a neurological adaptation where we're changing the ability to produce force, right? However, in general, the understanding is that a larger muscle with more surface area, with more contractile space, can then has the ability to produce more force. Is that kind of still up? Is that up for debate, or is that still kind of the school of thought that you've been seeing, Austin?
I believe they're shifting more towards that mindset where obviously bigger muscles are stronger muscles, and stronger muscles can lead to bigger muscles. So they kind of go back and forth with that. And it's funny that you bring this up, just because I was thinking about this like a few hours earlier. Like, I remember reading like ACSM texts where they talk about like strength, hypertrophy, and endurance, like on this like spectrum, right?
Yeah.
However, I begin to quickly realize that strength and endurance are more so like performance aspects, right? As opposed to hypertrophy, which is like a physiological like adaptation. So instead of putting it right in the middle, it should be kind of like along the bottom, just because you will build hypertrophy, you will build your muscle like throughout the entire.
I want to say we had that conversation before, where it is almost kind of like it's a physiological goal as opposed to a performance-based goal. That's a really good way to think about it, where it's like not on the continuum of like you go endurance, hypertrophy, strength. That's not necessarily how it goes. It's kind of a separate thing. So I really like that. That's a good point.
They may have to change the texts in those books and update that.
Might be a shift. Who knows? We'll see. In terms of, so now going back to programming, right? So, okay, so we got, what hypertrophy is, we got some general training parameters and how we can do so. When you're structuring a program, what's kind of like the general outline you go from a block perspective?
I would say we can go ahead and like talk about the terms real quick.
Okay.
So first and foremost, we have what's called a microcycle, and that's basically just going to be 1 week of training, or like the shortest cycle of training in which that you get all your sessions in as well as your rest days. So typically it's just 1 week. So that's a microcycle. A mesocycle is going to be a collection of those microcycles, right? So these could be like 4, 6, 8 weeks in nature. And a mesocycle is distinguished with an accumulation phase where you are increasing in volume over time, as well as a deload phase where like a week you back off considerably.
Absolutely. So, okay. So generally training block that you would prescribe for either yourself or a client, anywhere from that 4 to 8 week range is what you would do. How do you determine for the individual if they should have a shorter training block or a longer training block? Is it experience? Is it preference? How do you go about that?
So I would say it's a little bit of both. And ultimately it does come down to some sort of like experimentation. I do find that beginners would probably benefit from a longer mesocycle, maybe like 6 to 8 weeks, just because their bodies are so new to training that their exercise technique isn't going to be obviously like perfect at the start. So that longer period of time allows them to milk out those adaptations. For people that have been training longer and have larger muscles that produce a lot of force, they may only get away with like 4, 5, 6 weeks, just because as they're increasing in volume, obviously, and as they're increasing in volume as well as dropping those reps in reserve, their muscles are going to get torn up pretty quickly. They're going to get pretty quickly. So
now when you go about that programming, so for example, this is really cool because we both had a very similar philosophy in how we program. So let me know if this still resonates with you, right? So I like to do the 4-week block with a 1-week deload when I'm doing pure hypertrophy, right? That's what works best for me. And most of the times when I work with clients, the 4-week tends to work relatively well. And it fits sometimes well within a month as well. So it's like easy for people to conceptualize, right? So I'll have my base level of exercise that I know I want to do, making sure I'm hitting each major muscle group at least twice, like we talked about. And then each week I'm ramping up volume over time. That can be something like, I start with 3 sets of 8. Usually what I'll do is I'll increase the reps the first week. And then the second week I will change the sets. And then maybe the final week I'll change the sets again. It really just depends on how the first week goes, how taxing it feels, and what I want to accomplish from week to week. But essentially, like you said, increasing volume over time. Intensity is relatively the same. That's why I like using subjective like RP or RIR, because, hey, if I'm having a great day, I'm jacking the weight up. I'm making sure that I'm going to failure, that I'm getting stimulation. But versus if I'm having a crappy day and, 135 feels like my max for the day on bench press, I'm going to make sure that I'm appropriately loading as such. Then I get to that final week, which we call, the overreaching week, balls to the walls, right? Hell week. Yep, that's right. Hell week. Yep, I'm finishing it up right now. So I know how it feels, man. Freaking your volume is as high as it can be to where you're not exceeding your ability to recover, right? You're just at that door of like, man, I'm really pushing myself. I don't know if I'm gonna make it through this week, but of course you do. And of course you're able to recover. When it comes to that overreaching week, what's kind of the purpose of doing that? Why are we trying to get volume so high through this block?
Right. So I think going back to a little bit about overreaching itself. So from like a sports science perspective, ideally what happens is whenever you surpass a point where you cannot recover from, and then you deload, essentially this idea of supercompensation occurs where you you basically gain a lot more than as if you had not done that. And I would say it would be okay to surpass like those volumes in an overreaching week, just because you're not going to be training that long to where the fatigue is going to linger around and cause you to have effects of overtraining. It's just for 1 week. So surpassing that wouldn't be a big deal. I've known for like myself, I've done quite several blocks now where I overreach, and maybe towards that middle or like later at the end of the week, my performance drops off considerably, but I'm still pushing it. Mm-hmm. And that's something to just look out for. You don't have to necessarily hit that point, but it's something that, okay, like if you look at the numbers, like, wow, I'm not doing as much as it was last week. That's really a good indicator that you're overreaching.
Absolutely. So and that's a good point that's a good thing to talk about, right? Because that, I think, especially with people who are new to lifting, they might view that excessive fatigue as scary or concerning, right? They're like, oh my God, like my performance is going down a little bit. I'm a little bit more sore than normal. Like maybe this is bad. Maybe I'm going to get injured. But if done in an appropriate manner, and like you said, it's for a short period of time, followed by an appropriate deload, they can hopefully reap the benefits of accumulating that mass amount of stress, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right. Excellent. And then deload. So I know this term gets thrown around quite a bit, right? And then people just say like, well, you have to do a deload at this time, or the definition of a deload is kind of different. When you're programming a deload for hypertrophy, what does that look like exactly?
Yeah, there are a million different ways to deload. You could just take the entire week off and just stay at home and be lazy. That's one. You could also ideally with a deload, what you want to do is you want to drop the volume to an amount that where you are not training to seek adaptations anymore, right? You're just training below maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So usually this comes out to be like half the volume you were doing. So let's say like you're doing 4 sets of bench on during the overreaching phase. What you could do is just drop that to 2 sets.
Gotcha. Okay, so half the volume of the overreaching week.
Right.
Gotcha.
And then I know like Renaissance periodization, they talk about they talk about how much weight you should actually, how much load you should do. So like the first half of the week, you can do like the same weight or like 90% of the weight you did that overreaching week. And the idea behind this is that we want to like maintain what we just did, right?
Right.
And then that second half of the week, you can drop the load 50% as well.
Which makes sense, right? Because we're still providing adequate stimulation of the muscle through motor unit recruitment. We're just severely cutting down the volume so that way our body can recover from the damage that was
drop all that.
Exactly. Absolutely. I love it. So that's a good recommendation, right? So if you're programming, whether for yourself or for a client, you're doing that 4, 6, 8 week block, whatever you're doing, you're gradually ramping up volume over time. And that could be done in a number of ways. If you're doing an 8 week block, it might be increasing a few reps every week. If you're doing a shorter block, it might be just adding sets. Or if you're more experienced and you want to do some of those, specific types of overload, which is you're doing a AMRAP on the overreaching week on your last exercise, or whatever it may be, you're finding ways to gradually increase volume over time, get to that point where you are at or like just exceed where you're able to recover from. You take a week, drop volume and intensity a little bit, and then you ramp it back up. When you start on a new block, Austin, or let's talk about this first, right? Deload. This is an important thing too. With a deload, what do you do exercise selection wise or in terms of how you program? Do you tend to stay with the same exercises? Do you use this opportunity to bring in new exercises that you're thinking about for another block, or how does that go exercise selection wise?
Yeah, so this is another thing where there's really no right or wrong way to go about it. You can stick with the same exercises that you just did, that overreaching phase. I would say one thing to look out for with that is that if you have sort of like lingering injuries, or maybe like your connective tissue feels kind of iffy from that week of hard training, if you do stick with those same exercises, you could potentially cause more stress on those areas. I've experienced it with that myself. The thing with choosing new exercises, though, is that they could be such like a novel stimulus that it may cause you to like achieve adaptations from that. So your deload week may turn into like an accumulation week.
Right.
New exercises.
Because you're having such a new stimulus, right?
You just got to be super careful with that. And one thing I would say, like, it's a safe bet to do is just make sure that you're staying pretty far away from failure. So maybe
Absolutely.
like five reps in reserve, good to go.
That's typically what I do. Most of the, there's only so many lifts you can do, right? And so many variations. So usually during my overreaching week, I use that as a time to start structuring my next block. So, because it gets me excited. I'm like, okay, I'm killing myself on this week. And now I can start looking forward and getting excited to what I'm doing next, right? Because I'm done with these exercises for a minute. And then I'll use the deload week. Like I also said, cut volume down quite a bit, intensity relatively the same for the most part. And then I'll use that deload to kind of play with what exercises I might want to do. It's a good way to experiment. So, for example, if I'm doing, barbell bench press for one block, and I'm like, man, I really want to incorporate a close grip dumbbell bench. I really want to try that in my block. I can do that in my deload week, and then I can see, did I like that? Did I feel like I was getting a good stimulus, even though it was kind of that deload recovery period? And do I want to actually move forward with that? And it kind of takes the mundane routine that you might get, right? Because that can happen, right? You're doing the same thing for at least a month. Some people, if you do the 8-week block, it's 2 months. That can get very repetitive for some people. And it's a good way to kind of just spice things up a little bit. So definitely a good opportunity to try that. Okay, Austin. So I run the block. I'm building up volume. I'm overreaching. My quads are on fire. I recover. I do whatever I want to do with my deload, make sure volume is cut down. How do I get into the next block? Is it kind of the same process of just this wave of up, deload, down, and then swap exercise, or how does that work?
Yep. So pretty much it's just like a rinse and repeat process, right? You're gonna start out with loads that are gonna be around like 3 to 4 reps in reserve that first week or two, and then as you go on, add sets, add reps, maybe add weight, and then as you start to do that, your reps in reserve are just going to continue to drop over the weeks, and then you just overreach and then deload again, rinse and repeat.
Absolutely. And this is one that I sometimes go back and forth on because, as I mentioned, there's only so many ways you can do a bench press, right? Especially if we're focusing on hypertrophy, you want to maximize the bench press. What are your views on, we talked about the repeated bout effect, right? What are your views on in terms of how much change you make in your program, right? For example, if you're doing a leg day, do you swap out every exercise for a different variation? Do you keep a couple staples, or how do you go about programming that way?
I mean, I think like with a general rule of thumb, if it's not broken, don't fix it. So if it's working,
right,
you're still able to like progress in weight. If you're progressing significantly, like you're adding a lot of weight, just keep doing it. If you're not having any like lingering problems with like maybe like your elbows, your hips, or whatever, just keep doing it.
Absolutely. And I like that you mentioned the injury part, because me, the pain and injury side of things I love to talk about. I more often find with the pain and injury side, yes, there's overuse things to consider, like, tendinopathies and things like that. The thing I usually find is it's more of a program design issue than an exercise issue, meaning you did too much volume too quick, or you were just, the amount of volume you accumulated in a block was absurd. And then your elbows start bugging you. You get a little shoulder tweak, right? It may not be the exercise per se that needs to switch, but maybe you might have to lower the amount, or at least make it more gradual. The way you increase volume over time might be a consideration.
Yeah. There's a million different ways to progress. So
absolutely.
Playing around, finding which one works, and just going from there.
Absolutely. And I like that. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? Another big one is range of motion, right? So, Austin, I need you to confirm for people, do partial reps work? Can I just do 21s with the easy bar bicep curl and I'm good to go? Or what's the story with that?
So my answer to that is it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on the context.
Austin, I'm tired of these middle of the road answers. I'm tired of this gray. I need definites. Come on, man.
I mean, in general, I would say general rule of thumb, full range of motion is going to be your best bet. Obviously, with those things you mentioned, like partial reps and like 21s, you're doing partial range of motion. I would consider those to be more so like metabolite techniques where like you're doing 21 reps, you're really trying to get that burn in your biceps. I wouldn't consider that to be what we call like straight sets, which is going to be the majority of your training. And I know I mentioned that earlier.
No, absolutely. And would you say that when it comes to a full range of motion, is that because you're able to stimulate the muscle? I guess I almost said through the full range of motion, like repeating myself. Is it because you're utilizing the entire muscle, or what is kind of the reasoning behind why we want the full range of motion as opposed to partial?
When you take a muscle through its full range of motion, you're going to be activating all the motor units that you possibly can. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to activate those motor units to stimulate them to grow.
Gotcha.
So if you only do like a bench press and you come halfway down, you're not activating the motor units as if you would go all the way down and touch your chest and come back up. So
want to get the most bang for your buck, right?
Right.
Excellent. Now we've kind of talked a little bit about new lifters versus advanced lifters and maybe some of the differences. So for maybe people who are new to lifting and want to get into hypertrophy, how do you go about that in terms of getting ready to structure their program? What do you do?
So it's a tricky topic with this one because there's going to be a lot of difference between what I do and what someone that's completely new is going to do. Typically with a new lifter, I automatically have them around like 3 sets of every exercise instead of maybe like 1 or 2, just because they're obviously new to lifting. They don't have much experience with the lifts. They need to focus on establishing good technique. And if they're not practicing the movement enough, they're only doing 1 set, it's not enough for them to kind of learn how to use their muscles like that.
Absolutely. No, I like that because I use it as like I almost said a training block. It's a good way to get the skills down, right? So you're taking time to learn form and technique. If someone is new to the gym, right? I've had this example before, right? Someone hasn't touched a dumbbell in their life and they're like, I want to be as jacked as possible. I love the motivation. Let's build adherence first, right? So can I get you in the gym consistently twice a week? Can I get you to enjoy training and show up? Can I at least get you to those basic exercise guidelines, right? 2 times per week, each major muscle group, and then also getting your cardiovascular exercise in, right? I'm going to start there first before I'm like, all right, we're doing a 4-week block and a deload's coming after. So get ready, kid. I'm going to make sure I got down adherence, good technique. It's a good time to learning in the habit of training. And then I can go ahead and focus on hypertrophy specific later down the line. With advanced lifters, so let's say you have someone or people who have a little bit of training under their belt, you kind of just do what we discussed, which is find their preferences, find their time schedule, plug and chug and throw them right into a block.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Just start low with volume and just increase from there. It's like, I know I mentioned on one of my posts, it's like how a doctor prescribes you medicine, right? They're going to start with the lowest possible amount and then they're going to increase the dose as needed. And then obviously with lifters, we want to increase the dose of volume. So
absolutely. Yeah. I know it's funny. I hear the same thing from the barbell medicine crew. It's like personal training. Our job is to prescribe exercise, right? So that's what we're doing. Sometimes you got to up the dose of what you're doing. Very good, man. So yeah, that's about all the talking points. Is there any other things that hypertrophy related or training related that you wanted to cover that we maybe didn't get to?
I guess going back to the last point we talked about with like more so beginners, when it comes to optimal training for hypertrophy, like I said, we want to establish good technique first, right? And that's why we do usually more sets and just you can progress via like reps instead of more sets.
Mm-hmm.
So once we have good technique down, I think it's really important that we learn how to train hard. And what that means is like relative intensity. Like we learn what 3 reps in reserve looks like, 2 reps in reserve, that kind of thing. Just because, like I mentioned before, beginners have a hard time doing that.
Of course.
And once you have that down, lastly, focus on mind-muscle connection, which is basically being like in tune with your body, being able to perceive feedback from the muscles that you're working. So, and there's like 2 different ways you can perceive, I guess, like mind-muscle connection. One's going to be related to like tension or like how much force is being produced with the muscle. And then the second one is going to be like that burning feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing like a heavy set a bench press, let's say you're doing like 6 reps, that weight's going to feel heavy in your hands. And mind muscle connection is going to be, can you feel that heavy load in your chest, like with each rep? And then with the burning feeling, that's going to be mostly related to like the accumulation of those metabolites, like we talked about, like lactic acid, hydrogen ions, that kind of thing. So, and that will provide that sort of like burning feeling. And as opposed to like how heavy a weight feels, once you do a set in like 8, 10, 12, 15 reps, you will start to feel that burn. And you need to make sure that you're able to be like, okay, I'm doing lat pull down. I can feel my lats, they're on fire. Like that.
Absolutely. Would you say 2 things I want to talk about? First one is when you're working with a new person and you're trying to get them to understand reps in reserve or train to failure, what kind of strategies do you use that maybe young coaches or people who are working with themselves can kind of understand? How do they get there? Do you set up like an AMRAP somewhere in the workout? That's of course with, supervision, so you can help them if needed, or how do you go about having them understand like, hey, this is what 3 reps in reserve actually looks and feels like?
Yeah. So I'd say first and foremost, you just want to get down pat with them, like what the concept is. Once you got that, just start asking them during your training sessions, like after a set, okay, how many more reps could you do? And hopefully you as a trainer kind of are able to distinguish like 3 reps in reserve versus like 0 reps in reserve. And there's like a lot of different ways you can look at it. One like super general rule of thumb I heard is that when you're taking a set right around 3 to 4 reps in reserve, that weight will slow down significantly in your hands, and it'll feel like it just got a lot more challenging just like that.
So. No, absolutely. Velocity has a good correlation with, or I've been hearing that velocity has a relative correlation with in terms of your proximity to failure. So that could be something like you can notice subjectively. It's like, oh, I'm able to make it fly. And then you hit a rep or 2 and you're like, oh, I can't really move this as quickly as I was just a few seconds ago. Maybe I'm getting close to where I want to be.
Right. And then your question on like using special techniques like AMRAPs. From my personal experience, I think that's how I learned how I learned reps in reserve myself, was from doing sets like drop sets. And basically all I did was I would just take the set pretty damn close to failure, maybe like 1 or 2 reps away, and then I would just drop the weight and just do as many as I could. I wouldn't count at all. I would just try to get that feeling down. And obviously I didn't have a trainer like a few years ago, so I didn't really know. I just kind of like got the feeling of it. And then once I started learning more, that's when I knew, like, oh, that's what I was doing. Right.
Absolutely.
It may not be appropriate for some beginners.
Of course.
Techniques, just because obviously
it's a lot of stimulus.
They're hard to do, and yes, it's very stimulative, and they may not want to come back to training with you if you.
It's very possible
to do that.
You're right. So, it definitely depends on the person, because I've had people where like I'll take them through like an intro block, and then maybe at the start of a new block or like the time we get to the end of another one, I'll be like, all right, how many more reps could you have done? And they're like, I could have done 3. It's like, let's test it. Let's actually see. I'm going to be right here with you on your bench press. And you said you could only do 3 more reps after 10. You're going to go and see if you can get past 13. And we're going to see. And then sometimes they're like, oh, wow, I could actually do more than I thought I could. Or sometimes they're spot on and it's good to go. But it definitely depends on the person. Like some people who like challenges that are more competitive, they love that. They're like, okay, I said I could get 3 more. Let's see what I can do. Other times it can be a little bit defeating for people. So it's really just understanding your person and what's going to work best for them. And of course, making sure you're not giving them too much volume in the beginning when they're brand new, because then they're going to hate you and never come back. And then,
and I know the muscle and strength pyramid text from Dr. Eric Helms, they talk about how you can try to estimate reps in reserve, and I can just go ahead and read them off real quick.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one way you could do it is just record a video of your set and just rate your reps in reserve after that set. Go back and watch. This is obviously helpful if you're training alone, you don't have a trainer with you.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing they talk about is that you could try a short block of like maybe 3 to 6 weeks where you're doing pretty low volume training, but you go to failure quite often. So this is kind of like counterintuitive to what you were talking about, just because we always say we want to start at a high reps in reserve, and as the weeks go on,
right,
we drop and go closer to failure. So there's a lot of different, like, I guess, different people are going to have like their different training styles, and this could be something that you do. And like I said, you train low volume and you go to failure quite often, and you just make sure that you have either like someone to work out with, like a spotter, like another trainer, and you take all those tests of failure to really test like how much can you push yourself, how much can you do.
Absolutely. Do you ever use percentage of 1 rep max when you're programming?
So I personally do not. I think it's something that you can definitely do, and it may be helpful for those people that don't know how much their body can handle. If they do know like an estimated fibre,
right,
you can walk them through all those tests. But since I'm more advanced, and like I definitely know like 3 reps in reserve, 2 reps in reserve for my body, I don't really need to, but that can be something that you use to kind of gauge their limits, how much they can handle.
I primarily use RIR, RP as well, because we've talked about this before. Percentage of 1 rep max changes on a daily basis. So what your max was, and then if you're not constantly updating it, you're using one from 6 months ago, who the heck knows if that's still up to date. The other thing is that I've heard some research where they'll give lifters, I believe they're more so intermediate advanced, but they'll give lifters a percentage of their 1 rep max, for example, like 80%, because they'll have them max out prior within a short period of time. And then a couple of days or a week later, they'll have them actually, see how many times they could do 80%, 75%. Now, if you hear like, for example, bench press, 80%, you're thinking, oh, you could get, anywhere from 4 to maybe 8 reps if you're lucky. But there's so much individual variability where some people are hitting 20 plus on a prescribed 80% of what they just maxed out on. So for that reason, I'm not a huge fan of percentage of 1 rep max, but I do understand for people who are new to lifting, having like a concrete number from something they've accomplished in the past might just be simpler and less intimidating for them, possibly. One other thing, I wanted to get your perspective on this because this is one that cooks my noodle quite a bit lately, and that is the mind-muscle connection thing, right? So from person to person, everyone feels a little bit differently, right? Like we were just discussing, you're like, bent over row, I really don't feel it as much, or it's more taxing in different ways than I want. And then specifically hitting my lats or my traps. For me, it's high bar back squat, gets my heart rate up. I do feel my legs working, but I definitely feel it more so in other exercises. So if an exercise does in fact work the muscle group, for example, let's use the back squat, right? You are going into passive knee flexion and active knee extension under load. So your quadriceps are working whether you feel it or not. Would you say that it's more important to have an exercise that's high volume, that stimulates a lot of motor units, but you don't feel it? Or would you rather someone do something where they feel it more, like let's say a Smith machine, but they can't maybe load it as much? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. To be honest, I see both sides and like the reasoning behind like which like this might be better or that might be better. But honestly, I think the best falls somewhere in between those two, to be honest.
Right.
I'm not sure of the specific research behind like the mind muscle connection. I just know it's out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think Schoenfeld had made something recently, and they talk about like how having an internal focus versus external focus led to I think more muscle gain. So it's definitely something, and obviously like the research is always changing. But.
Of course, because like the biomechanics part of me goes like, well, I'm actively extending under load, so the muscles like, it's like the common meme. It's like when someone says, use your glutes, but you're extending your hips. Like, of course you're using your glutes, even if you don't feel it, you are using your glutes. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to stand up and complete the lift. But I do also, it's like some exercises, man, it's just like, man, I like leg extension is the best example for me with quads. There is no other exercise that kills my quads that I feel it more than a leg extension. And whether that's a subjective experience that makes me just want to keep doing it, I always include leg extension in my program because I feel like I'm getting more bang for my buck. Very, very good. So kind of the last thing I'll ask you, man, and then we'll kind of put a nice bow on this and wrap it up. How is overall your training going? And then like, what's kind of, next steps for you because you're graduating soon, man?
Right. So as far as what do you mean by training? Like my workouts or?
I should have specified. Yes. Your training that you do personally for yourself.
So right now, I kind of just eased back into training a few weeks ago just because I had a surgery done. So just wanted to make sure that healed up. Like right now, I am still focusing on growing everything pretty much with a little bit more focus on chest. So that's why I am doing like a third day where I'm incorporating chest volume. So what I'll do is I'll hit chest Monday, Thursday, and then Saturday like I did today. As far as like my split goes, like I said, I've just been doing basically push-pull legs. And then that last leg day, obviously I do some more chest. I've been doing that ever since I started lifting. So pretty much like 4.5 years now.
And you don't know Austin. It's trust me, it's freaking working. Okay. Like this kid is jack. And I seen the photo when you were younger, right? On the leaner side. So the program is definitely working. Trust me.
Yeah. So we're just sticking with and just making sure we're, consuming enough calories, feeding our body, resting enough. Things just work out like that.
Absolutely. And then, so you're graduating soon. And then what are the hopes for what's after that?
So right now I'm looking at hopefully continuing full-time as a trainer. And I hopefully want to move somewhere warmer than Indiana. I'd say like anywhere is better than here. No Indiana. I'm just kind of tired of it here. So I'm thinking about moving to Texas. Don't know where yet, but.
Austin, it's okay, man. I'll say it for you. 10 inches of snow is bullshit. Everyone knows I'm from South Florida. I went to grad school for 2 years up in Indiana. Holy crap. When you hearing -5 degrees and actually feeling -5 degrees as you're scraping ice off your windshield at 6 a.m, they're two different things. So listen, wherever you end up going, man, wherever warm weather place you stop at, I fully support that decision. Just know that the Sunshine State will always welcome new people. So we'd be happy to have you as well, sir.
For sure.
Well, Austin, thank you, man. I really appreciate it. I know this is going to be the first of many conversations that we're going to have because, we talk every now and again about training. And as we mentioned, the world of hypertrophy is changing constantly. And I'm excited for, where life takes you, man. And I know you're going to do great things wherever you go, whether it's helping out with education or being a trainer. So I'm excited for future conversation, man. Let the people know where they can find you.
Yeah. So my Instagram, I believe it is Austin Lee _06. And that's just my personal one. I don't have like a separate fitness one just because I pretty much bleed this. So that's all I'm about. So I just post everything on there. And you can also find me, like I said, where I'm at Park West Fitness right now. It's in West Lafayette in the research park, training there. If you want to train with me, hit me up. Let me know. Slide in my DMs. We'll
Absolutely. And for those who want to learn more about me, Instagram at @the_shift_method. Again, we got content basically every day, whether it's inspiration, educational content, going over new exercises, or things like the podcast here. The podcast will be on YouTube and Spotify. We're recording this on Saturday. Most likely will go up on Monday in the morning. So be on the lookout for that. I'm going to try and make it a weekly thing depending on availability of guests and my schedule as well. So hopefully something to look forward to, but I won't make any false promises. You can also head over to theshiftmethod.org, the website. Shirts are still available. Masks are still available. Be sure to cop one yourself if you would like one and want to support the movement. That would be greatly appreciated. Again, theshiftmethod.org for the website and at @the_shift_method for the Instagram handle. Austin, it was a pleasure, man. Hope you have a wonderful day. Stay warm up there, bro. And you take care, okay? Take care.